Bom dia, gente. Estamos
Bom
aqui,
dia.
eu e a Alice, para começar a palestra da professora Luiz Conel. Só lembrando algumas informações de praxe, a gente vai mandar a lista de presença, não esqueçam de assinar para receber o certificado depois. Quando acaba a palestra, a gente fecha a lista e aí não tem como assinar mais. E mandem as perguntas no chat, a apresentação vai ser em inglês, só lembrando a todos, vocês podem mandar as perguntas em português que a gente traduz para passar para elas, se for preciso. Então, ao longo da apresentação, podem ir fazendo perguntas. No final, como sempre, tem aquele tempo para debate, dúvidas, comentários e coisas do tipo, certo? Então, eu vou ler para vocês aqui a introdução dela. Só um momento. So, we're receiving here today Professor Louise Connell. She is a professorial research fellow in the Department of Psychology at Maynooth University. She is an interdisciplinary researcher in psychology and cognitive science with a focus on the sensorimotor basis of concepts in semantic memory and the role of language in cognition. Using techniques from cognitive psychology, psycholinguistics, corpus linguistics, and computational cognitive modeling, her work has pioneered methods to examine how language and sensorimotor experience underpin key cognitive functions, like categorization, memory encoding, and abstract thought. She has published over 70 peer-reviewed papers and book chapters, and her research has been funded by the European Research Council, Science Foundation Ireland, Leverhulme Trust, British Academy, and the UK Economic and Social Research Council. She has a PhD in cognitive science from University College Dublin and has held academic position in Lancaster University and the University of Manchester. She currently holds a public service fellowship from Science Foundation, Ireland. So welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
Alice and I were going to leave the screen right now and put your presentation here too. And now be free to give your presentation.
Lovely. Thank you for that. Good morning, everybody there, and thanks for having me to this. So I'm going to be talking about some of the stuff that was already mentioned in the intro about how sensorimotor information and language underpin a lot of what we do in cognition whenever it involves concepts. So when I'm talking to linguists, I'll talk about semantics, and when I'm talking to psychologists, I'll talk about concepts, but really I mean the same thing. So I'm interested in concepts because they're so kind of fundamentally important to so much of human cognition. It's what we call, if we have offline cognition, if you have to think about something that is not right in front of you at the time, that isn't an immediate stimulus, you are drawing on a representation from long-term memory, and this is a concept. So how we learn these, the rate at which we learn these hit different developmental milestones in childhood. By being able to think about things that aren't right in front of us at the time, it underpins a lot of what we talk about in language. We don't just talk about perceptual stimuli we can see. We most often talk about things that are not right there. And there's some evidence that concepts can be used to kind of scaffold complex thought. So in other words, you need a certain number of concepts, a certain level of abstractness in your conceptual thought before you can think at a high level. And then when you're getting into clinical work, impairments of the conceptual system is highly debilitating. So for all of these reasons, we care. We're very interested. So I'm going to be talking about a few aspects of this today. I'm going to run through the theories of representation that I'll be testing and that I'm kind of most concerned with. And then I'll talk through some work that we've done in my lab about how to measure the sensorimotor grounding of concepts and how that might be useful. And then what happens when we try and investigate whether it's language or this sensorimotor information that's doing the most work in cognitive processing in a given task. So there are many, many theories of conceptual representation, but the two that I am most concerned about bringing together are what's called grounded cognition or embodied cognition. And against that, what's sometimes called symbolic representation, but really it's just in terms of language representation, distributional representations in language. And these have all sorts of different names in different parts of cognitive science. As I mentioned, they can be concepts and semantics as well, but other areas we'll talk about knowledge representation, or we might talk about semantic memory in particular. And there are areas of this research where people are famous for arguing pointlessly about the exact theory that they favor at any one time. So I hope I'm trying to take a slightly different view here, and I'm bringing together a couple of theories instead of pitching them against each other. So when I talk about grounded representations or embodied representations, you might have come across this as perceptual simulation or embodiment in general. And these kind of theories would hold that our conceptual systems kind of co-opt, steal temporarily, our sensory and motor systems for the purposes of representing conceptual information. And if we bring this down to neural terms, because a lot of the early work in this was about neuroimaging, it means that we can see modality-specific areas of the sensory cortex. So you've got the visual cortex might show activation when you're thinking about whether bananas are yellow, just in the same way it would when you are shown a yellow stimulus. And you will get the same thing, some of Friedman Pulvermuller's early work looking at the motor cortex as well, that when you read the word kick, you get activation in the foot-leg area of the motor cortex, or at least in an area very close to it, that overlaps with the area of activation you get when you actually ask people to move their foot in the scanner. So from all of these kind of early imaging studies, theories began to be built up in more detail that assumed that whenever we're representing a concept that involves sensory or motor information, we are using the sensory systems in the brain and the motor systems in the brain in order to represent those things. And then from the absolute other end of the spectrum, which it goes back to an idea in the 50s, we have the distributional hypothesis. And the basic idea of this is that you know a word from the company it keeps. So that the kind of statistical distributions of words in language with other words, the arrangements of those encode very complex semantic representations. And these are often called linguistic distributional models, but if you're hearing about large language models and stuff like that now, they all build off the same basis. And sometimes they're called co-occurrence models or distributional semantics. There are different names on different flavors. But the basic idea is the same, that you get rich semantic information from the distributional patterns of words in language, and that these patterns are quite good predictors of human performance across a range of conceptual processing tasks, language processing tasks, that kind of thing. So these theories assume that you might have sensory motor representations in there somewhere, but you don't really need them. You can do most of the heavy lifting in cognitive processing just by drawing on these statistical relationships in language. It gives you enough information to get by. So what this really means is that the way a lot of people try to present them is that these two theories fight against each other. And there's a number of us have been trying for quite a few years now to convince others that really they can work together, they can go hand in hand. So if I tell you the word kitten, and that brings a representation to mind, then perhaps you're picturing a small fluffy baby cat. Perhaps you've got some other touch information in there about how soft it is. Perhaps you can imagine the sound of meowing or purring. There is all that sensory motor stuff possible. But also, when you hear the word kitten, well, we know it brings to mind other words as well. This is what drives semantic priming. We know that you are likely to be primed for words like cat, fur, meow, claws, tail, other kitten and cat related words. And the automatic activation of these other words, well, depending on why you're thinking about a cat, this could be very useful in cognitive processing terms as well. So the likely thing is when you hear a word like kitten, both of these things are active. You get the sensory motor and the linguistic representation active at once. So that raises the question, which information are you using in a cognitive task? So here's an example. If this isn't work of mine now, it's work by Max Larissa and Rolf Svan a good few years ago. But if I were to ask you which of these two cities is further north, Seattle or Boston, there's a couple of ways you could do it. You could try and visualize a map of the US and sort of compare, well, okay, which of these appears to be higher up on my mental image of a map of the US. Which is fine if you have a decent mental map of the US, but not everybody does. So the other way to do it is to try and guess, okay, well, could I guess based on the distributional information that I'm hearing here? What does it mean to be in the north, in the Northern Hemisphere? Well, Northern contexts in English in general tend to focus on things like cold and snow, whereas Southern contexts tend to focus on things like it being hot and sunny. So am I hearing words like cold and snow more often with Seattle or more often with Boston? As it happens, you get them more often with Boston. So it gives you a reasonable answer. That would be the correct answer. Boston is further north. And you could do the same thing for Houston and San Diego. You could try and, well, which of those do I hear more in terms of Southern contexts? And you can use that to pick the right answer. So in this piece of work, what they did was look at this really specifically. They took LSA, which is one of the first kind of early distributional language models, and they compared a load of city names to the word north or to the word south. And they plotted those on the y-axis. And then they actually looked at the geographical latitude on a map to see how far north they actually were. And they did it for different locations. They did it for the US, they did it for China, I think, as well. And they might have also done it, although that could have been a different paper, for fictitious cities from The Lord of the Rings. But the point is, language alone was actually a pretty good predictor of the geographical position of those cities. That real latitude correlates with these measures from the model about from 0.32 up to 0.44. Not bad. So if you don't have a perfect mental map of where a particular pair of cities are, just using the information you've got from language can actually approximate it really well, reasonably well. Or to give you another more kind of cognitive example, if I asked you, is a pillow concrete or abstract? It's a semantic decision task. There are a bunch of different norms out there. For English, the Calgary semantic decision norms are a great resource. And most people don't have any difficulty saying that, oh yeah, pillow, that's concrete. Sure, it's an easy decision to make. It doesn't cause people any difficulties. They do it in a little bit more than a second, and that includes reading the word. So how do they do it? Well, they could figure out that, okay, well, concrete things, you usually can, touch and see them. Can I touch and see a pillow? Yep, okay, must be concrete. They could do that. That's the assumption of the basis of the semantic decision norms that are out there. But another way to do it is use the distributional information of the words that occur around pillow in language. We tend to talk about pillow more in contexts of concrete things than abstract things. So if we used a distributional measure to compare pillow to concrete and pillow to abstract, it turns out it's not a bad predictor. So that plot there is just about the distance from a given word to concrete, and it's done for like 10,000 words here. And it's a reasonable predictor, 0.2. It does a little bit better when you add the distance to abstract as well. So again, just from these examples, we can see that there's two different types of information you might be able to use to make the decision. You could use sensorimotor, you could use distributional information from language, but it's not necessarily easy to tell exactly what people are doing at a given time. So this is kind of what led to a whole research program that I've been running for the last few years. Which information do people use? When do they use grounded representations and when do they use distributional representations? Or in other words, when are we using sensorimotor experience as the basis of our judgments? And when are we using our language experience instead? Now, this sounds like it should be an okay thing, maybe to be able to investigate. But when I started out on this, which is, oh golly, more years ago than I care to think about, but more than 10 anyway, it very quickly became apparent that there wasn't enough information out there in order to be able to do it. If you are trying to make claims about what people do in terms of conceptual processing, you can't just run an experiment that has like 30 words here or 50 words there. You need to do it at scale. And the human conceptual system of an adult is huge. The estimates vary, but if we're talking about an educated adult native speaker of English, some work by Mark Brisbert has shown that they know approximately 40,000 unique words, and these are lemmas, so don't get tied up in morphological variations there. And 40,000 lemmas, 40,000 concepts is huge. So it's very easy to get distributional measures at that scale because those linguistic distributional measures, they just come from corpus linguistics. Get a large corpus of a few 100 million words, run a model on it. You'll be able to get measures for any 2-word pairs that you pull out. But sensorimotor measures at that scale, no, they just did not exist when we started off. The best you would be able to get would be maybe a few 100 words if you were lucky, but they were a few 100 words from very particular classes. Like you might get a few 100 concrete object nouns that people had collected feature norms for. Or you might get imageability ratings for 1,000 words here, a few 100 words there. But imageability has other issues I can talk about a different time. But they were nowhere near the scale. So if you only have sensorimotor measures for a tiny subset of the human conceptual system and linguistics distributional measures for everything, you tend to get very lopsided evidence. You tend to get quite a lot of studies showing that distributional models can predict anything. But we just didn't have the capability at the time to say, yes, but could sensorimotor information be doing that as well? So that led to the first kind of major stage of me starting to look at sensorimotor information. Can we do this better? How do we measure the sensorimotor grounding of concepts? So that sounds like a reasonable question. Great, let's start with sensory information. And it seems straightforward enough. With sensory information, people tend to talk about kind of classic 5 senses. You got vision, hearing, touch, taste, and smell, the same 5 senses people have been talking about since Plato. Sometimes people will consider overall perceptual experience without differentiating between different modalities, but we decided to press ahead with looking at these different senses separately because each of them is processed in a distinct area of the cortex. And we figured that that gave us reason enough to want to segregate them in terms of their measures as well. But it's not just 5. We also realized after a few years that nobody was looking at interoception, which is the sensation of things inside your body. Now, there's a lot of research on interoception out there from a kind of physiological and a neuroscience perspective. It covers a very broad range of sensations. But if you think about having a headache, being hungry or thirsty, the sensations you feel inside your body when you cough or when you're ill and you have a fever, when your muscles go into cramp, there are so many different things that fall under interoception that aren't captured by any of the other modalities, not adequately. So all of these concern, in physiological terms, homeostatic systems, the systems that work to keep your body in a stable, functioning state. And all of these sensory signals from homeostasis, they go through different parts, but they tend to be integrated in the insular cortex. So as far as we were concerned, we figured that interoception seems to meet the same criterion as the classic 5 senses, and really we should be norming it. So that's what we decided to do for sensation. We also then said we really should be looking at action. Now, a few people had normed action before, but not in a way that we were terribly happy with. There were some generic action norms out there. So how much does experience of this object involve interacting with it? But again, we thought it would be more important to segregate different action effectors, different parts of the body, because there's a motor homunculus. We know that there are very distinct areas of the motor cortex controlling distinct parts of the body. And there was a parallel in breaking up action as there was with perception. So we decided to go then with voluntary movements of specific body parts. And we could have gone down to a very fine grain, but we decided to stop at 5. So this is what we ended up with as our set of things we decided we would norm. We had 6 perceptual modalities: vision, hearing, touch, taste, smell, and interoception. And we went with 5 action effectors: movement of the head, excluding the mouth, movement of the mouth and throat, hand and arm, foot and leg, and then separately the torso. And each of these there was evidence already out there we could just point to, saying that each of these is processed in a distinct area of the sensory or motor cortex. So we set about norming them, and this was an enormous project. We got about 2,500 people involved in rating the perceptual strength norms, and then a separate sample of 2,000 people doing action strength. We had 40,000 words to cover, which was why the samples got so big, but we were running this online via Mechanical Turk. So each word was rated by somewhere between like 20 and 50 people, thereabouts. So we asked people for perceptual strength. We had done a little bit of work on this before. To what extent do you experience chair? By hearing. Rate from not at all to greatly. By tasting, by feeling through touch, and so on. And then the action strength people saw a slightly different version of the wording. They saw, to what extent do you experience chair? By performing an action with the foot and leg. Not that much, really. Hand and arm, maybe, you do like reach out and touch or move chairs with your hand. Head excluding mouth, not a lot, and so on. So we got these norms done. They're out there. There's actually a bunch of different people have run these norms now in a lot of other different languages. I don't think Portuguese yet, but it's waiting if anybody wants to do it. We did these norms. Each of them then, you get a mean rating for each of those dimensions once you've cleaned the data and validated it. And so I'd like you to think for a moment, if I talk about baby, what kind of sensorimotor experience of baby do you have? And people tend to agree quite a bit. You can see babies, you can hear them, you can touch them. Amusing to me anyway, you can smell them quite a bit. And also you get some bits there on hand and arm, on head. Interesting as well is that you get a spike on interoception, although that tended to have been very heavily on the female side rather than the male side of the ratings, maybe unsurprisingly. You don't tend to taste babies. It's not 0, but it's almost 0 for gustatory. So you get this kind of multidimensional sensorimotor profile for every word in the norms. So there is the baby one. Chair, as you can see, looks quite different. Again, you don't taste chairs, but you do see them and touch them. And chair, experience of chair does involve movement of the torso and the foot, leg, and hand, arm, because you're sitting down in them. They also work for abstract concepts. So things like anger, and I'll come back to this in a little bit, it's very heavily interoceptive. You feel anger viscerally, you feel it inside your body, and that comes out in these ratings too. You also have other aspects. You can hear it, you can see it, you can experience it by motion of the head. and mouth as well. Some of that can be involved in speech. And no matter how abstract the word is that you care to throw at it, you will get a sensorimotor profile for it. Very classically abstract words like republic still have a sensorimotor profile. It's not that it's non-perceptual or non-sensory. It has a distinct profile. Even very strange things like unhampered, a particularly abstract word that's a little obscure because it's a negation as well, you still get a distinctly sensorimotor profile for it. So we had 40,000 of these. And it's been used for various things since. So these ratings, it's useful in predicting visual word recognition, things like lexical decision and naming. It helps with remembering words, word memory. I'll be looking a little bit about categorization later, but yes, we found that too. And that it can be used to provide some insights into conceptual content. What is our structure of semantic memory? And I'll dip into a couple of these things now. So first thing, when we were in the process of collecting these norms, we wanted to make sure that our idea to collect the interoceptive ratings wasn't just a silly thing, that there was actually something to the fact that these are going to be important for conceptual representations. There's no point collecting semantic ratings if they're not useful to predict something. So what we decided to do, we had about, when we wrote this paper, about 32,000 of our 40,000 words we had collected the sensory ratings for at this point. So that's what went into this analysis. So we just examined what we had got of these cleaned ratings, and we just split the words we had into abstract and concrete. They were slightly more abstract than concrete randomly at the time. In the total set of 40,000, it's almost 50-50. This is from work that Mark Brisbert had done. It's slightly more than 50% of words are abstract in English compared to concrete. So when we look at the distribution of the ratings that we get, perceptual strength is the rating in each modality, we see that, kind of unsurprisingly, I guess, concrete words have higher visual strength than abstract. Because sure, you can see concrete things and you can touch concrete things. But the other ratings are not so straightforward. And we were particularly interested in interoception because here we see that abstract words have higher interoceptive ratings on average than concrete words. And we had predicted this because if you're talking about visceral sensations inside the body, quite a lot of emotion words are abstract. They're classed as abstract when you ask people. And quite a lot of emotions are viscerally felt. They're felt inside the body. So we were expecting emotion to kind of bump up the interoceptive ratings for abstract words, and we found it did. We decided to look then at emotions in particular. So we identified 547 emotion words, emotion concepts. And I can thank Bryony Banks, my postdoc at the time, for putting that set of words together. And we matched those then with 547 control words that were other abstract words, non-emotions, that had the same concreteness ratings, the same word class, whether it was a noun or an adjective or whatever, and importantly for us, the same effective valence. So they were positive or negative to the same degree as whatever the emotion words were. And here we find again a very clear difference. They're kind of neck and neck for the other modalities. Maybe the control words are a smidge higher on vision, but the important part is that for interoception, emotion words in particular are much higher on interoceptive strength than other abstract words. So this was showing us that, if you want to characterize the sensorimotor experience involved in abstract words, you can't leave out interoception because it is used to ground emotion words in particular. We then wanted to just triple check the last thing. If we're right, if interoceptive information is being used to ground abstract words, and abstract words are more than half of our conceptual system, then we should see it facilitating lexical decision and naming. This goes back to kind of very old tradition of what were called concreteness effects on word reading. People are faster and more accurate at reading concrete words than abstract words. And we had previously shown that this isn't about them being concrete or abstract so much as this is about them having perceptual information in them or not. So what we did is that for the exact same set of words, we took the maximum perceptual strength of the classic 5 senses, so leave out interoception, and they're the grey bars in that graph. We found that, yeah, sure, it does predict lexical decision and naming, response times, and accuracy. We'd already shown that before. We were just showing it again here for a bigger sample of words. The new thing is that if we instead change that measure for the same set of words, don't take the maximum perceptual strength of the 5 senses, take it by including interoception. So in other words, those words for which interoception is the strongest modality, words like anger that we saw earlier, but there were many more, they will now have a new rating. So when we use that as a predictor, does it improve performance? And yes, it does. We see on the orange bars there, once you include interoception in the calculation of the maximum perceptual strength of a word, it's much better at predicting both accuracy and RT in visual word recognition. So because retrieval of or activation of semantic information in visual word recognition is automatic process, you don't need it, it happens anyway, and it will facilitate the process when it is activated. This result shows us that people are automatically activating not just sensory information, but interoceptive information as well when they read a word that involves interoceptive experience. So, okay. On the back of that, we were pretty happy with our measures of sensorimotor grounding. We were content they were doing what we wanted them to do. So we said, right, let's use them. What can we learn from this in terms of the structure of semantic memory? And for this, we decided to look at a category production task. Now you'll be hearing a little bit more about this later on. But category production, it's also known as semantic fluency, and it's used a lot both in kind of classic cognitive psychology, but also in cognitive neuropsychology, especially in like investigations of cognitive decline and dementia and that kind of thing. Classically, the semantic version of verbal fluency just asks a participant to list as many whatever as you can in 60 seconds, usually animals. List as many animals as you can in 60 seconds. Go. But you can do it for any category, and there's plenty of other norms out there, not quite as large as ours, mind you. So you can ask about birds, dairy products, fruit, furniture, musical instruments, whatever it might be. And in each case, you record what people say back and you mark it up. And you can do it for abstract categories as well. So name as many kinds of crime as you can in 60 seconds. Or emotions, or family relationships, or political systems, or religions, whatever it might be. So we had 117 categories in total from this other data set, slightly more concrete than abstract. So what we did then was for each category, we looked at all of the different members that participants had listed. Some had relatively small sets. There might only have been 10 or 12 total members that were listed. I recall one of them, for example, is months of the year, and there was only 12 of those, thankfully, although not everybody listed all 12. But then animals, I mean, I can't remember exactly now, but I think there's more than 60 or 70 unique animals listed across the whole data set. But on average, 17.8 member concepts per category. So what we did is for each of those member concepts, we had a sensorimotor profile from the norms we had created. So for each dimension in it, for every sensory modality or action effector, we just calculated what the mean profile was for that category. So all 117 categories then had a unique profile. And we began to examine, great, how similar are these different sensorimotor profiles to each other? What we found is that when you look at concrete categories, at the very top, all the concrete categories together, it looks a bit messy. You get consistent visual. You can definitely see concrete things, but you get some head action just as well. We were more interested though in the subdomains. If this is the concrete domain of semantic memory, what do the sub areas look like? And the answer there is very different. One of the clearest categories to come out as being different to everything else was things that are ingestible. So this is things you can eat or drink, or also in there are consume as drugs or alcohol. So it has visual, like all concrete things, but this is the only category that has gustatory, olfactory, and mouth movement. So it's food, it makes sense, things you can taste and smell, and you use your mouth to interact with them. So on average, the ingestible category looks like that large plot there, but I've given some examples on the side of some of the subcategories like fruit and dairy products. And as you can see, they look almost identical. All of the subcategories below this are very, very similar to what the overall subdomain of ingestible things is. But that wasn't the only one. When we look at non-ingestible things, they break up further. And they break up into animate entities, animate concepts. And animate things are different, things like animals and birds and things like that, because they have auditory experience. And no other concrete concepts really, no other subdomains really have consistent auditory experience. So again, although animals and birds, you can see the profiles look a little bit different there, they can be distinguished. It's very clear that it's visual, head, and hearing is used to experience them. Other subcategories or subdomains that came out then, inanimate split into natural and artifact kinds. We weren't expecting something so artificial sounding. I know it's a classic ontological distinction. We weren't really expecting it to come out in terms of sensorimotor experience, but it does. The inanimate natural categories, they tend to just be about visual and head experience. But kind of importantly, they don't involve taste, they don't involve interoception, they don't involve touch and hand-arm action much. At least they involve less than other non-ingestible categories. So this is where you have things like natural landforms, like mountains and hills and that kind of thing, are actually not that dissimilar to experience of flowers and trees and plants and that sort of thing, in that they tend to involve visual and head more strongly and an absolute absence of taste and smell and interoception. Artifact kinds, though, are different in that they do involve touch and hand-arm action, which you might expect. Artifacts are made by humans to do things. So you have tools there. You definitely use your hands and arms to interact with those. You have furniture there as well. Other kinds of inanimate artifact categories. They look reasonably similar, although the extent to which you use your hand and arm tends to vary. So with all of these together, you end up with this kind of hierarchy that lets us say that, you know what, concrete concepts definitely do have sensorimotor grounding, which isn't a surprise, but it's very variable. And the biggest distinction in the concrete domain is not between natural artifact, or it's not between animate and inanimate. The biggest distinction in sensorimotor terms is actually between ingestible and non-ingestible. And only when you look at non-ingestible categories do you get more classic domains like animate, inanimate, natural artifact coming out. Any given dimension on that wheel might be important to an individual concept, but it didn't come out as being consistently important to a category. So there's plenty of variation in experience once you drill down, but this is what comes out when you start looking at the structure. So maybe for concrete, it's kind of predictable to some extent. We already knew about distinctions like animate, inanimate, natural artifact. But let's do the same thing for abstract. When we look at abstract categories, we see something that looks a little bit like the concrete one in some ways. You get consistent head action and very variable vision. So sometimes you can see abstract things. It just depends on the subdomain. When we start to drill down into abstract categories, we see first a split between internal and external. So internally focused abstract categories, this is where you get emotion. And this is where interoception comes in hugely. So head action and interoception, they tend to define internally focused abstract categories most clearly. But emotions are not the only kind of abstract concept that rely on interoception. We also see it for categories like personal quality. So personal qualities, people listed things like kindness, generosity, meanness, the kind of qualities that an individual character might have. And they too rely quite heavily on interoception for their grounding. Now, when we look at the other side of this, externally focused categories, we see a further split into social and non-social. If we look at the non-social, so externally focused, non-social abstract categories, this is where we see vision coming in. So we still see head action, but now we see consistent vision for the first time. It's reasonably strong, it's always there. And you get this for things that should appear very abstract, like sciences, kinds of science. You get people naming physics, chemistry, geography, whatever, biology, neuroscience. All of those, they tend to come up quite heavily on head vision, a little bit of auditory as well. But you also get it just for pure numbers. One of the categories we asked people to list members for was prime number. In many ways, you couldn't find a more abstract category than a particular class of number. And yet we're seeing sensorimotor grounding there. We're seeing visual grounding, in particular, quite likely because most people's experience of prime numbers involves seeing them written down. They might be harking back to their school maths lessons, or they might be thinking about something that they have read recently that might be about prime numbers. I don't know. But the visual experience is most likely tied up not just in the learning of them, but every time you experience them since. Chances are you're not experiencing them as part of a conversation with no visual aid. You're experiencing them with visual input too. And this is where vision comes in. So then if we switch to the externally focused social categories, we get vision coming in here too, but also, which separates them clearly, auditory and mouth information with the absolute absence of interoception. Social categories are things like crime, types of crime, murder, robbery, assault, that kind of thing, but also social relationships. So, friend, neighbor, boss, family member, that kind of thing. When people are thinking about their experience of those, auditory and mouth action comes up so much because these social categories involve communication. They involve speaking and listening with other people. And that particular sensorimotor profile really clearly distinguishes what's going on here. So in a hierarchy, we get abstract concepts splitting, the way I had mentioned there. And they too have variable sensorimotor grounding. And their sensorimotor grounding is as strong as that of concrete concepts. What differs between them are the precise dimensions, the shape of the profile is what matters. So in other words, abstract and concrete categories, they're not separated by the extent of sensorimotor information involved in them. They're only distinguished by the type, the profile. So what we argue on the back of this is that there isn't any fundamental dichotomy between the abstract and concrete domains in sensorimotor terms. And kind of more broadly, if there isn't a sensorimotor distinction between abstract and concrete, we kind of try to argue that if it isn't useful, then why are we using it in the first place? We might be very fond of the abstract concrete distinction as this convenient ontological split that we assume exists in semantic memory, but it certainly doesn't exist in sensorimotor experience. And if sensorimotor experience is the basis of our semantic memory, particularly in the early learning of it, and there's no concrete abstract distinction there, why are we using it? It might not be a useful way to try and understand conceptual structure at all. So at this point, we're fairly content that we have a good measure of sensorimotor grounding. We're fairly content that it gives us really rich information to understand how the conceptual system, how semantic memory might be structured. So now that we have this, now that we have good quality sensorimotor measures, can we go back to our first question? Can we try and figure out, right, now we have sensorimotor measures at the full scale of semantic memory, just like we have linguistic measures. Can we please figure out which kind of information people are using when? So if we go to our semantic similarity, a classic task. If I ask you, is mountain more similar to hill than to bottle? People find this really easy. It's like, of course it's more similar to hill. This is not something people get wrong. But what information are they using? Well, you can argue that, as many people have been doing, it's a classic cognitive way, that people are using some sort of experience-based representation to compare mountains versus hills. Oh, there's a lot of overlap there. They're both tall, they're both steep, they can both be climbed. Whereas mountain and bottle, not much overlap there at all. So yeah, let's go with hill. However, semantic similarity is a classic task that has been used to test distributional models since distributional models first came about in kind of the mid-90s, so early 90s. So being able to use these distributional scores from these large corpus-based models, you compare mountain to hill, you can compare mountain to bottle, and you find that mountain and hill share more contexts, more similar contexts than do mountain and bottle. So you just use the information from language and you say, yeah, hill is closer to it in terms of its linguistic contexts. People could use either of these. So which is a better explanation? We went back to our sensorimotor norms and we made a new set of norms out of it for sensorimotor distance. Every one of those 40,000 words compared to every other one of the 40,000 words. There are 800 million word pairs in this database. And we use cosine distance between the vectors if anybody is interested, but it looks like this. 0 as a distance measure. 0 means they are incredibly close together. They are on top of each other. If you compare a word to itself, it'll have a distance of 0. It has a maximum distance of 1. And as you can see in the plot there, not very many concepts reach that maximal distance. I think we do get some over 0.8, maybe 0.9, but it's quite a small tail. But you do get a nice distribution out of it. There's a good level of variability in there. So this is a candidate experiential measure to use. Is it good for semantic similarity? Well, having created that big 800 million word database, you can imagine it as this 11-dimension space where every word is a point in the space. And if you look at a point in the space, say for the point occupied by guitar, which as you can see is strong on auditory and hand-arm, a little bit less on vision, touch and head. If you look at the points that are most closely clustered around guitar in that space, that's what you get back here as the nearest neighbors. So the most similar, in sensorimotor terms, the most similar word to guitar is bass guitar. Yep, fair enough. Kettle drum, accordion, cymbals, violin, they're all musical instruments here. Now, they're not all stringed instruments. We're seeing drums and accordion coming in there too, but they are all musical instruments and they're very, very similar in sensorimotor terms to guitar. That's interesting. We're seeing categorization spontaneously emerging here. We see other kinds of information emerging too. If we take the word sprint, as in to run very fast, the nearest neighbors there are also concerned with movement, briskly, dashed, swiftly, jog, run, but not just with locomotion, not just with movement of the body, because we're not seeing walk and stroll and amble and words that would suggest slow movement in there at all. So the sensorimotor experience is not only giving us words to do with locomotion, it's giving us words that are sensitive to speed. This is fast motion. fast locomotion of the body. So to find that sensorimotor information is sensitive to speed information and movement, we didn't expect it, but it does come out. Other example then for abstract words, welcoming as a point in the space. Its nearest neighbors are a little bit different. There are things like flirtatiousness, rapport, friendly, provoke, expressiveness. They're all to do with social interactions with other people. And they're generally quite positive social interactions, perhaps with the exception of provoke. Provoke could be negative as well, depending on the context. But again, even though that's an abstract word, we're seeing useful semantic clustering around it just from sensorimotor experience alone, and so on. So if we ask people to compare a bunch of words, well, we didn't ask them, other people have asked them, provide a similarity rating. How similar is mountain to hill? How similar is welcoming to flirtatiousness? How similar is guitar to kettle drum? And you correlate those ratings with the distance, with the sensorimotor distance you get in our database. We find that it's actually, the sensorimotor distance is as good predicting semantic similarity of concrete word pairs as it is for abstract word pairs. And indeed, mixed, you see in the middle, it's slightly higher. It's still just within bounds of error, really. So mixed is where one word is concrete, one word is abstract. Things like information and book would be kind of similar words when you get people to rate them, even though one is abstract and one is concrete. So sensorimotor information is useful for semantic similarity in both the abstract and concrete domains. I'm hoping that's not a surprise by now. So that's handy, that's great. Let's compare different similarity metrics and see what information you actually need when you're trying to predict human ratings. So there are so many different theories of semantic similarity, and each of them comes from a different theory of conceptual representation or conceptual processing. So our one of sensorimotor distance, this basically comes from the grounded cognition sensorimotor simulation stuff. We also have, as I mentioned earlier, the distributional hypothesis, and this is where a language model, we took somebody else's continuous bag of words, one of the word-to-vec models for that. But just because we were going to be fair, we chucked in a couple of other measures as well that come from different theories. So there's theories of a fixed taxonomic hierarchy being kind of hard-coded in semantic memory. This is like semantic networks. For that, we took WordNet distance as a predictor. There's also then feature-based models like family resemblance view or correlated feature views of the conceptual system. They use conceptual feature overlap. And we took that as a candidate measure as well. So when we correlate them all against each other, just before we look at the human ratings, they all correlate a bit, but between kind of 0.2 something and 0.4 something. So moderate correlations. Or in other words, each of these measures appears to be capturing unique information for the most part. One is not completely subsumed by the other. But when we then try and apply this to human ratings, we took not just the one data set that I showed you earlier that had a mixture of abstract and concrete. We took 3 different data sets that were out there. 2 of them were based on ratings. People were asked to rate, I think it was from 1 to 7, how similar are these 2 words. But we took another data set because it had a bigger sample that was based on forced choice scores. So you see a keyword like mountain and 2 words below it, hill and bottle, and you have to just pick which one is more similar. And across a large sample, you can calculate scores then for each word pair from that. I won't go into the details, but I use Bayesian linear regressions for pretty much everything. But what we did was that it's a little bit like stepwise regression, but less statistically problematic. You chuck in all the candidate predictors, you select the best fitting model for each data set, and then you rank order the importance of each predictor within that data set. So what we find is similar-ish between data sets, but some differences. We find that sensorimotor distance is always necessary. It's always the second best predictor. And then either the linguistic distributional model or the taxonomic model is strongly necessary as well. That'll be in first place. The others, not so much. Very limited use of correlated features. You get most of the variance explained by the first two predictors. And sometimes for some data sets, given measures mightn't have been a predictor at all. So what we can take from this is that the sensorimotor distance between concepts does make this independent, robust contribution to human judgments of semantic similarity. And it works in both concrete and abstract domains, but it's not sufficient alone. You also need symbolic information. So this is linguistic distributional or taxonomic. That's another form of symbolic information, contributing independently as well. So this kind of data set suggests that when people are trying to judge whether two concepts are similar or not, they're using a range of information and they're drawing on both sensorimotor and symbolic and linguistic and other information too. Now, I have a note in there that it needs better controlled benchmark data sets. It does. We took other people's data sets because they're commonly used in computational linguistics for testing large language models and other kinds of distributional models. But from a psychology point of view, they are not well constructed. So I would like to see this done better, but I don't have time to do it myself. We're content, though, that from what we can see, both kinds of information are being used. And then we come to a very different kind of task. I mentioned category production earlier. Name as many animals as possible. And different individuals will come out with different long lists. Some people produce huge lists for everything. Some people tend to produce only a handful of items for others. But it's such a fundamental task that all sorts of theories are built off the back of it. That what people produce in these category fluency tasks is assumed to reflect their access to semantic memory, and in particular, their access to particular structures in semantic memory. As I mentioned before, it's quite widely used in all sorts of areas. So we're interested in this because we now know we have this sensorimotor distance measure that seems to contain spontaneously categorical information. So if I give you a category name like animal, then and look at a couple of different members, cat and animal, they're quite a short distance apart. Their sensorimotor profiles are reasonably close. Whereas animal and butterfly, although butterfly is technically an animal, its sensorimotor profile is quite different. You don't hear it for one, and you tend to touch it an awful lot less. So it looks different. So from this information, we were kind of thinking, right, well, on the back of this, we would predict that people should be far more likely to name cat as a member of animal than they would be to name butterfly. And more than that, they're probably likely to name it earlier as well. So when they start listing things, the shorter the distance, the sooner they're probably going to name it too. But on top of that, you've also got linguistic distributional measures. People talk about all these things all the time. And when you look at it, which is work that we had done years ago, I think I did this in my master's thesis, you find that category names like animal tend to appear in the same contexts as individual members pretty often, but it varies. More typical members, like cat, tend to be mentioned alongside their category name much more often than atypical members, like butterfly. So I've given you some examples of the kind of contexts where you get them appearing together. So in a large corpus, you'll think like, oh, my cat is a funny animal. She took a stray cat to the animal shelter. A cat makes a classic animal, an excellent animal companion. So cat and animal co-occur in quite a range of contexts there. But you have to hunt much harder to find animal and butterfly co-occurring in the same way like that. So this lets us use two different predictors. We have sensorimotor distance and linguistic distributional proximity. Do they appear in close proximity to each other? And although in this example, they seem to reflect the same thing, cat is closer to animal than butterfly is in both of those kind of models, it doesn't apply across the whole set. In reality, when you look at much bigger samples, these two measures, the sensorimotor and distributional measures, they don't correlate hugely. So this was our full experiment. As I mentioned earlier, we said that we predicted that people will name, or people are going to be more likely to name a member concept as part of a category when it's close in sensorimotor distance, and also when it tends to appear often in close proximity in language. And also that we would expect it to appear earlier in the list, sooner. And in theoretical terms, as well as just saying that these kind of category production responses would use both forms of information, we explicitly predicted that people will be, if you like, required to draw on the linguistic information, that the sensorimotor information won't be enough alone, that you'll need linguistic information as well to predict people's responses. And this was the experiment where we originally collected the data set that I mentioned earlier, where you had 117 different categories that were both abstract and concrete. And we had 20 people naming all of the members, as many members as possible of each category. The analyses that we used, I won't go into it in detail unless people want, but it's just worth saying that we took 4 different measures out of it. One was production frequency. How often is cat named in the category of animal? One was mean rank. So when we look at the rank order of where cat appeared in animal on average across people that named it, where was that? Another is first rank frequency. How often is cat named first for animal? And also then, because we were recording these measures and then had to go back and transcribe, we took the response time to name the first member back. So response time for first responses back. And we used word frequency and some other things as a control in each case. So the results. We were interested in whether our 2 predictors, sensorimotor similarity and linguistic proximity, whether they would both be important to predicting human performance. I mentioned that they don't correlate very much. Across the whole data set, the correlation between these 2 predictors was only 0.06. It was negligible. So what we find for production frequency is that yes, people do use semantic similarity. Sensorimotor similarity is the same as sensorimotor distance, I should mention. They do use the sensorimotor information, but you need linguistic proximity on top in order to capture performance. And the same held for mean rank and the same held for first rank frequency. Nothing predicted RT. Not even word frequency predicted RT, which was shocking to us. So it turns out that response times in category production tasks, which people do not usually look at, in fairness, they're very, very difficult to predict. They are very noisy. Not even word frequency can explain them, which is almost unheard of in a psycholinguistic context. So the less said about RT, the better. So what this shows us is that, yes, we're right. Both sensorimotor and linguistic information appear to be contributing to category production. People name a member concept earlier and more often. They'll name cat for animal. They'll name biology for science. They'll do this when the member concept has a really similar sensorimotor profile to whatever the category concept is, and when the word appears in close proximity to the category name across language. And again, because we had abstract and concrete categories, we decided to look at it, split it in half, run those analyses again. There were no systematic differences there. You can see that things move around a little bit, but in both cases, for trying to predict mean rank, sensorimotor information was a stronger predictor than linguistic information. But on the other hand, when trying to predict production frequency or first rank frequency, it flipped. Linguistic information was a stronger predictor than sensorimotor. So no one form of information dominates for any particular categorical domain. When people are naming concepts, they're drawing on both types of information all the time. Now, we could have stopped there, but we didn't. We decided that we would also move on to a computational model because my original background, it's worth saying, is in computational work. And whereas I really like experimental psychology, and I think, experiments are great, psycholinguistic experiments are great, you can only get so far with verbally describing a theory. If you really want to test a theory in the hardest possible way, build a model out of it and see if it does what it's supposed to do. Because if it doesn't, you haven't specified a theory right. The theory is not correct. So we decided we'd give ourselves a hard test. And working with Kai Wingfield, a postdoc of mine, we created the first full-scale linguistic sensorimotor model of semantic memory. It was kind of a novel form. There were two components to it to reflect the two different forms of information. One of them was a linguistic component that was 40,000 words linked by something like those proximity scores we saw a little while ago. And then we had the sensorimotor component, which was the 11-dimension space from the norms that I mentioned before. What we did, very, very roughly, was allow them to link up in a spreading activation style. So in other words, we would present it with a category name like animal, and you would see the animal word being activated in the linguistic network. You would see the animal point in space being activated in sensorimotor space, and then we just let activation spread from there in both components. We had lots of other things going on I won't go into, but there was limits to how many concepts could be activated at once, and concepts had to get over a certain threshold of activation before they could be considered as a candidate member of that category. So kind of give you a toy example of how it works. When animal is activated, the first words that might be hit by that activation are probably not relevant. Things like human, husbandry, words that appear in proximity to animal. But from there, if you let the activation spread out further, now you start getting relevant things like cow and horse or greyhound or whatever it might be. They will get activated then. We've also got then in sensorimotor space, imagine that's 11 dimensions instead of just 2 in that plot. Here, the first things that it spreads out to hit, actually quite often, a lot of those are candidates for membership. You'll get things like cat and dog being activated, but also you'll get irrelevant words like rain activated too. As we go through, as either linguistic or sensorimotor components activate words, they're put into a store. And if they reach over a certain level, they might be proposed as, oh, this actually passes as a potential candidate for this category. So what we find when we look at the model's performance is that we wanted to know not just is it able to hit category members, because we said it's going to be able to do that. We want to know how well does the model mimic human behavior. So in other words, if you track the model's performance, and if you track the performance of every individual, there were 60 participants in that experiment in total, can you distinguish the line of the model from the lines of all the humans? So what we were looking at then is kind of a hit rate. How often does the model performance fall within a standard deviation of participant performance? And I won't go into the very complex way we had to calculate these things here, but this one is modeling mean rank. And it finds that if the concepts activated by the model, 84.6% of the time, what the model is coming back with is within a standard deviation of what humans do. It's like, that sounds okay, that's fine. But more to the point, if you try and examine what people do, if you take a random participant and you say, well, how often is this random participant within a standard deviation of the mean? It's actually less often than the model. Random participants are within a standard deviation of the model mean, as you might expect, only about 70% of the time. So the model is doing pretty well. Oh, 68% of the time, even closer to what you would expect for one standard deviation. So that was when we were predicting mean rank. You get something quite similar coming out if you're looking at modeling production frequency. So how often is a given concept named for a category? And we were interested here, though, because we had a model, we can split into the linguistic and sensorimotor information in a way that we can't do with humans. So when the complete model is doing a reasonably good job of mimicking what humans do, what happens if we turn off one of the components? What does linguistic information alone do? What does sensorimotor information alone do? Well, when we do that, performance just collapses. You see that the linguistic component, it drops from like 85% down to 31%, 30.8. By coincidence, you get exactly the same score for sensorimotor, but actually you can see the plots are very different. So neither form of information alone is enough to capture human performance. You need them both. And actually, it moves on a little bit more than that. When we looked at total model performance of when it had proposed category members and they had matched up with the human ones, we were also able to record in the model, okay, well, which component proposed that member? Was it the linguistic component or the sensorimotor component that put forward cat as a member of animal? And we found that actually most of the time it was the linguistic component. 61% of the time it was linguistic compared to 39% for sensorimotor. So this might not be exactly what is going on in humans. We have to be careful that we don't kind of overreach the conclusions you can make from the model. But because the model lets us do things you can't do with humans, like turn off entire portions of semantic memory, then it's certainly a proposal that's worth investigating further. When people are naming category members, if they don't have access to language, well, it'd be difficult to name category members anyway, but if they're just trying to think of them, even if they didn't have to name them verbally, it would be very, very difficult. We would expect them to be massively impaired at that, compared to if they had lost access to sensorimotor information, they still might be able to get by just on the basis of linguistic information alone. So what this shows us, or what this lets us conclude to a certain extent then, is that both sensorimotor grounding and this linguistic distributional knowledge, both of them make independent contributions to category production, to semantic fluency. These contributions are similar in both the concrete and abstract domains. I didn't put up the graph for some reason there, but because we concrete and abstract categories, we were able to split those and look at it. And there was no systematic difference in modeling terms as well as in empirical terms. It supports the linguistic shortcut idea, that hypothesis in conceptual processing, which says that if it's possible to complete a cognitive task just on the basis of linguistic information without having to draw on sensorimotor information, that's what people will use because it saves cognitive resources. And our findings would support that. And as I mentioned, the computational model suggests that in category production, linguistic distributional information may dominate. It may be accounting for most of the variability, or a lot of the variability that we see. So, to conclude more generally, from all of this, and I hope I haven't gone through it too fast now, both sensorimotor experience of the world and language experience of labels for concepts, language experience of just the words we use. Both of these things together are what combine to give us semantic memory. They're what combine to give us a conceptual system that's very robust, that's very flexible. So the fact that sensorimotor information and linguistic distributional information, the fact that they seem to reflect some of the same information some of the time, like the animal and cat relationship being much closer than the animal-butterfly relationship, that's not a bad thing. Like many complex systems, redundancy is good. So if we have a functional redundancy between the sensorimotor and linguistic components of semantic memory, this allows us to be much more flexible in day-to-day conceptual processing, but also much more robust, much more able to survive cognitive decline, I would argue, degradation of information over time, but also just if you're busy, if you're under time pressure, if you're trying to retain other things in your head and you can't quite fit whatever it is that you're trying to do, there might be another route to it. Things don't catastrophically collapse just because you lose access or even temporarily to one kind of information. So having this robust, flexible system means that from one occasion to the next, you might not be using exactly the same information twice running to do the same task. If I sat you down today and asked you to name all the types of science that you can think of, I could model exactly, well, perhaps these responses are more likely to come from the linguistic system, these ones are more likely to come from the sensorimotor system. But if I asked you to do the same thing next week, you would give different responses back, and the source of those information might be different. So you're not necessarily using or accessing semantic memory in the same way twice running, because you've got a complex dynamic system here, and it's influenced by all sorts of things like the goal of the task, the resources you've got, how tired you are, how much you care about doing the task accurately as opposed to quickly, all sorts of things. And this is good. It's this flexibility that lets us perform reasonably well, even when things should be going wrong. So I would argue that we need them both. People use sensorimotor and linguistic experience together most of the time. One individual might rely more than another. Some work that a PhD student of mine was doing was starting to look at individual differences there, but it gets very, very messy. But there's interesting work to be done on whether an individual might be more inclined to want to use linguistic information versus sensorimotor information over time. So the take-home message, I suppose, is we use both. You can't consider one without the other, and you certainly can't talk about semantic memory without both sensorimotor and language experience being involved. All right, thanks very much for your attention, and to all the nice people who helped me with all this research and also gave me the money to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Marosa, tá mutada.
Sorry. It has been happening a lot. Thank you very much. The lecture was really, really amazing. Our group has personally been studying a little bit about it, mostly because of Alice. She's studying that. So it's really, really interesting for us. Alice, you want to start making a question?
Okay. I had a question here. I put it on YouTube. Yeah. I was curious about the head action, and I thought that people would consider the mental work and not a sensorimotor experience. I was thinking about what would I consider if I was doing the task.
Yeah, so we were concerned with this when we were piloting the norms, and we really did what we could to strip that down to being just about sensory experience. So we did a couple of things to achieve that. One of them was the fact that the phrasing that we used for that particular rating would have been, to what extent do you experience laptop, because it's in front of me, by performing an action with the head. And action in that form, we found that people were not particularly thinking about cognition. They were thinking about it in terms of muscular action. But the other thing we did was, for all of the motor norms, we gave people a little avatar to illustrate exactly what part of the body we were talking about. So for head action, it was like a side profile of a head where the mouth and throat were excluded because that belonged to the mouth and throat rating. So it was just the head part, if you like, from nose up. If I could zip back, you can probably see it. But anyway, so by doing these, when we were looking at piloting norms, we put in words like thinking and cognition. We snuck in some words like that to see would people give them high head ratings. They didn't. The occasional individual did, but on average, they're not very high on head ratings at all. Concentration, I do recall, did have a higher head rating, and on asking people afterwards, why did you give that rating for this? They told us, well, because you frown when you're concentrating. And so they were actually thinking of it in terms of facial movements rather than internal cognition. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I'll read one of mine now. This question I thought about in the beginning. So when you gave the example of a negative word, so about negations, did you observe if they are activated like a positive word, like unhappy would be equal to not happy, and then happy would be the core concept activated, or are they sensoriously different?
It's a good question. We haven't looked at negations specifically. We took our list of 40,000 words from a list that Mark Brisbert had prepared already when he was collecting concreteness ratings, because they had been sort of pre-screened as 80% of native speakers know them. So there are quite a lot of negations in there, but we haven't looked systematically at whether unhappy is closer in sensory terms to happy compared to sad. I don't know. It would be interesting to look at.
I was thinking about this question, and in the end of the speech, I was thinking if it would be the sensorimotor correlate, and the negation itself would be just a linguistic correlate. Do you think it would be kind of possible?
I think, and this is me just coming at it from a purely psycholinguistic end of things, I think when you have educated adults with high reading abilities, they're no longer, they're reading words like unhappy as single tokens. They're no longer splitting it into the morphological stem and core. It just doesn't happen like that. They're reading the words too fast for that to be the case once the words are over a certain frequency. So I think you might get that breakdown perhaps for some low frequency words that have a negation stem on them, but for the higher frequency words like unhappy, I would lay money on the fact they're being read as whole tokens, and that they have a more distinct, I would expect it to be more similar to sad than happy if I was forced into a prediction.
Good. So thinking actually about what you said right now, I was thinking if the mental representation would be stable as people grow. Like if we consider kids, they still not necessarily kids that don't speak yet, but people who are illiterate, for instance, or people who maybe don't speak.
I think they would be massively variable. But I don't think people have I don't think people have stable representations even as adults. I don't think there is such a thing as a static representation. I think they might be long-term stable, but they're not static. They do change over time and even just over usage. I mean, you get short-term priming effects. That's changing the profile. So if you were to go back and try and look at the developmental trajectory of kind of sensory grounding changes over time, that would be amazing. Nobody has done that. That would be really cool. But I think you could probably make some really interesting predictions there. So there's long-standing, I mean, I'm not a developmentalist, but there's long-standing work showing, children start by acquiring concrete words and the abstract words come later. But if you were to start looking at, say, emotion words or some kind of core set of early but abstract-ish words, would it be possible to see a particular change over time in how the profile shifted? What I'm trying to say is there a predictable trajectory to how the profile would change with age? And is that the same across different subdomains? Is it the same for emotions as it is for something really abstract like sciences or prime numbers? I don't know.
Mhm.
It'd be very interesting research for someone to do, though.
Yeah, I have been thinking about it since you started the presentation, and even about people with different specialties. Like you gave the example of a kick in the beginning of your speech, but maybe not. I expect my representation to be different from a soccer player. So
Yeah.
or even when you mentioned like butterfly and cat, they don't have the same they are not equally close to animal, but maybe for, I don't know, a biologist or someone who works
Yeah.
with butterflies, would they have a closer representation than the normal people do?
Yeah. I'd say it's distinctly possible they would. A good few years ago now, I know that people did some work with sommelier, with trained wine experts, and they're able to perceive, their olfactory perception is much more fine-grained, as you would expect.
Yeah.
They've been trained in it than like regular people. And there was one of the conclusions from that paper was that it's possible that because they have the vocabulary, because they have the words to segregate very small differences in sensory experience, is this actually what's supporting their enhanced sensory abilities? And this, it's feeding into linguistic relativity. It's all tied up together in the same kind of area. But I think those same ideas could apply to any form of expertise. So if you were able to, if you like, separate expertise that didn't involve a massive vocabulary jump as well from the forms of expertise that do, you might be able to tease apart whether this is increased sensory experience or increased sensory plus language experience that's making you better at this task. That kind of thing.
Yeah. We have more questions, but I just have one last comment. I can't hold myself. Because I was thinking about it, also different languages, because some languages, they categorize things differently. So maybe like you said, like digestible, non-digestible, animal or not animal, maybe this representation would also vary, because I also would expect like language to kind of organize our mental concepts somehow.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I would agree with that. I would love if somebody would collect full-scale norms in another language, preferably from a non-Western language, and preferably from something as far away as you can get from English. Because you need the scale to do it. If you don't have that massive scale, then you just don't get enough information to get those differences emerging. I mean, I know some smaller norms have been collected for Japanese and Chinese, but I think you're only talking about less than 1,000 words, and it's not enough to pull those kind of differences out. But if you did, I would say you would get some similarities. I think you would always get the ingestible stuff separating early. It's just so radically different in terms of taste and smell and mouth. But beyond that, the animate, inanimate, natural artifact, it would be really interesting to see how they would differ from one language to the next, because I think there's a lot of room there to not necessarily need those distinctions.
Yeah. So we have a question here. I'm gonna exhibit it from Thomas. So about us having a redundant system to build concepts in this model, repeating the sensory measures with born deaf and born blind people to see if the different sensory experience impairs the predictive power of the model would be a really nice test to its robustness.
Yeah, I agree. It would be really nice. Somebody has collected sensory norms from deaf individuals in Italian, and they've done some comparison in Italian to normal population there, but it wasn't in terms of the computational model. The differences were not as large as they were expecting. So even for, say, for deaf individuals, for sound-related words, they're still, if you like, inferring that there's meant to be auditory experience available, even though it's not personally what they're experiencing. And you get a lot of the same, structural information coming out about how similar words are. But again, that was on, I think, too small a sample to be really sure about what's going on. So it would be really nice to be able to do. It's just a very difficult population to collect the data from, because we don't really want to ask somebody to have to rate 5,000 words because we've only got like 20 of you. So I'd love if someone else did it, because I can't imagine trying to coordinate that at the moment. It's a good idea.
It's true.
Yeah.
Alisa, there's another question from you here. You want to read?
Sorry. It would be nice to know if in Portuguese guitar and bass guitar are as close as in English, as there is not a morphological similarity. But I asked this before you showed the model, and after I started to think it would be different. In linguistics, correlate but not sensorimotor. Is it?
Yeah, it's to be honest, two-word phrases like bass guitar are, I think we could handle it better in the model. I would prefer, we don't segregate them as we don't join them up as a two-word compound. They are actually treated as separate tokens. But yeah, in sensorimotor terms, you saw that they would be kind of similar in those terms. With linguistic, what we did for those kind of ones was, if guitar activated bass, we would settle for that. If guitar activated guitar, we discounted it. That's just silly. It's activating itself. Don't count that. So we tried not to let the model overscore itself when you did have overlap in terminology there. But there's all sorts of things we could do to make the model more sophisticated in the linguistic component, but it's computationally massive. I know it doesn't sound it really, but 40,000 words, not every word is connected to everything else. It is like a distributed network, but it was so computationally intensive, we had to move it onto the supercomputer cluster to run a full set of experiments, because you couldn't leave it running on a desktop. It would just fall over about 2 words in. So trying to make it more complex, we wanted to, and then for practical reasons, we just had to stop and just let it go the way it was. But those 2-word phrases, that was something that always bugs me slightly. I wish we had our own supercomputer to run it, so we didn't have to keep.
Yeah, and I was thinking some years ago, I won't remember the title or the authors exactly. I read a paper on natural stimuli, and people were using movies. I think the movie was The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, to see exactly like what happened in the brain, and they saw that some motor areas were activated depending on the actor's movements on the screen. And then I was thinking, if seeing action or experiencing it from different sensory mechanisms, like not from speech, would activate the concept the same way a word would, like seeing someone kick something and listening to someone say the word kick, would we probably activate the concept similarly, or you think
So
language would change it?
there's a little bit of work done on this already. This is, if you remember from a few years ago, mirror neurons were everywhere. That if you watch
Mm-hmm.
somebody perform an action, does that activate the same circuitry in your own brain? And the answer is like only some of the time. It depends what your motivations in the task are. If you're just watching passively, not so much. If you're watching with the goal that you will later have to replicate that action yourself, yes, maybe, possibly. That's where they did start to see effects. So I think it's tricky. Watching other people perform actions does seem to use some of the same circuitry, but you have to be motivated to devote some resources to processing that. But how you perceive people's actions is, if you like, it's very much, this is getting into linguistic relativity stuff again. It is
Yeah.
constrained to some extent by the language that you speak. This is all things like to do with, if your language encodes manner and path of movement, then you are going to represent an action. Like if you watch somebody rolling down a hill, you will represent that differently to somebody whose language encodes only one of those at a time. I don't like making linguistic relativity predictions because I know a lot of them don't come out, but it's all tangled up in there somewhere. I think that yes, as you use and acquire language, it's absolutely shaping what's being activated and what's being joined and together. How that's going to influence what's going on in your brain as you perceive a real life scene, maybe a little bit, but it's probably going to be totally overwashed by your own motivations at the time. Why are you watching it? It's like you're watching TV, you're watching a movie, and you see somebody shoot somebody else. That's going to produce a very, very different good, bad, and the ugly kind of context. Compared to if you saw that in real life, where you've got very different survival mechanisms going on, and that's going to be
Totally.
it's going to be completely, completely different. So
Yeah. We have another new question here. Let me put it down. So you mentioned the possible influence of, for example, attention on the process. Can you expand on that? I'm wondering how strongly it could modulate activation spread, and even if it could suppress the linguistic primacy and maybe force us to rely more on the sensorimotor system.
yeah, so attention is everything, but it's very messy when it comes to these kind of models, I have to say. If we're talking about just sensorimotor experience alone, we've done a little bit of work in my lab a few years ago, looking at how, if you just take a very, very simple word reading task, like lexical decision, that primarily draws on visual information. You're just reading a word on screen. It's mostly predicted by visual strength, not by auditory strength of what's going on in the concept. But if you're doing a word naming task, if you're reading it aloud, you've got all sorts of speech processing and auditory monitoring going on as well. Your attention is split across two different modalities now. And for naming, you do see facilitation by auditory strength, what you don't see in lexical decision. So there's a lot of kind of, depending on the task you're doing, you get a lot of kind of automatic spreads of attention that affect how you process the semantics of the word, even though it would have no reason to. It affects what's automatically activated. So that kind of thing we haven't applied yet to whether you could nudge it or use it to try and get people to rely more on sensorimotor or linguistic information. But yes, I would expect you should be able to. We have totally different series of work where we try and stop people from using linguistic information, where we force them to rely on sensorimotor information only. And it's not in terms of modeling. We do this for in memory tasks. So one paper we were looking at object memory. So we show people a list of objects that are linked together because they might be ingredients in a recipe, or they might be things you're using to like redecorate your house or something like that. People just see the images come up completely non-verbally, and then we test them afterwards. They have to pick each of those images out of an array again. The manipulation, though, is that while they're viewing the images come up in a sequence, we either leave them alone and they just watch them, or we get them to perform linguistic suppression, articulatory suppression, which was just repeating the word the over and over again. And that's a very useful task because it completely screws up your ability to access words of anything in front of you. It really impairs your ability to access language. So when we do that, we find people's memory is much worse for what the list of objects compared to when they're just allowed to look at them normally. We did another version of it where we had people watching a video of people putting together like a little flat pack toy or building things out of Lego bricks. And again, we found the same, that if you impair or inhibit access to language while people are trying to encode this, they perform so much worse on subsequent memory tasks. And in that action study, so they were, watching a scene, watching somebody building, putting together Lego blocks and to build like an alien or a bird or whatever it might be. We also did a control task, which was an auditory monitoring task where they just had to listen to a series of clicks and then perform an action when it changed to a beep. That didn't interfere with the task very much at all. It was only cutting access to language that did. So you can make people rely on sensorimotor information in more kind of obvious ways by giving them a whole other task to stop them from accessing language. I'm finding it really hard to think how you could do that in a more subtle attentional modulation way. It'd be nice, but I don't know how you do it.
Yeah. So he said he's gonna write one more question here, and let me see if there's something else.
We could ask the question you wrote here about numbers. I think it's interesting.
Yeah, but I think okay. In here. Because I think she has addressed that on my other question, but I have asked when you mention numbers,
sure,
if illiterate people would also activate them visually.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Don't have access to that kind of population here, not easily. But that would be, you could always see though for low cardinal numbers where you've got like hand counting, that would be, I'd say you still would get visual information. The really interesting bit would be whether you would get it for the higher ones, especially quite high numbers beyond 100.
Yeah.
Maybe not. That would be interesting.
I think it's interesting to see to what extent linguistic knowledge is present in sensorimotor norms when you're measuring it. I was thinking about it when you talked about. I don't remember what you were talking about when I thought about it, but I was thinking about emotions and colors. I don't remember talking about it, and you talked about something. It's very variable across languages, and I thought maybe language is also present in sensorimotor norms.
It's possible. I'm not quite. So much is variable from language to language. I'm not entirely sure. Things like, are you talking about like emotion color associations and things like that, or is it?
Yeah, I thought about it.
Yeah. So I know some people have done work showing that. I think they did it for 2 languages, maybe, that you do get emotion color associations can be predicted from those distributional models that you pull from language, and it tends to be more of a Western than just an English thing, really. But it's things like love is associated with red, blame marketing. I don't know. sadness is associated with blue, and those kind of associations that people do, that they are, you can pull them out of corpora, you can use those to predict people's responses and priming and stuff like that. But I haven't seen a really big, let's get two entirely different language groups with different cultural associations and see how that crosses over. I don't think anybody's done it at that scale. It'd be good though.
Yeah. Since you're talking about emotions, I have left another question there, but I was thinking you show that abstract words, they are usually more related to interoception, sensitivity, I don't know. And I don't know if it's related to language, it would fall into linguistic relativity again, but could that be because we usually express like feelings and stuff using internal expressions like your heart, your guts, your chest? I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's kind of, it's a chicken and egg situation. It's like, do we use those terms in the first place because that's what the sensation is, or do we experience the sensations because that's what the words describe? That I don't know where you'd even start unpicking that, but it's probably both. It's probably feeding off each other. Really interesting thing would be, you know, there's been lots of work done on like cross-cultural universality of emotions and how emotion categories differ from one place to the next, all of that kind of thing. And there's a pretty coarse-grained universal emotions, but not to the extent that we tend to break up all of the different categories. For example, I haven't seen anybody look at what words do people use in those particular cultures to describe those emotions. You know, can we get that kind of information out of it? What?
Yeah.
Is there a common kind of visceral experience of anger? Is there a common, I don't know, heart, chest experience of love? I don't know. It'd be really, really interesting to do. But you need, you know, an anthropologist in there as well.
Yeah,
that's true. So Fernando left another question, the one who asked about attention. He asked if there are electrophysiological data on that.
A little bit. I had a PhD student who was running some work on this in a very, very kind of early stages. It was before we had the full sensorimotor norms that she finished, so we didn't do the same kind of contrasts we've got now. Basically, it's messy. I think an awful lot of ERP studies out there are methodologically atrocious, and you can't trust 90% of the published work out there for various reasons. But if you don't pre-apply a region of interest, or rather a window of interest, and you run a more objective kind of Bayesian analysis of 50 millisecond increments, so you're just going to see what comes out and see where the level of evidence is without picking out your window. You do get some drift early on from language processing areas. You do see quite early linguistic activation before you see areas associated with visual processing, in this case, coming out. But it's very messy. So really, I want somebody to run it in an NG. That would be great. Where you have it with a much better spatial resolution on it, as well as the temporal res, of course. Because this is getting into the long answer to that question is where you see activation is not necessarily the source that provides the information you use to complete the task. You can see extraordinarily early sensorimotor activation within like 20, 30 milliseconds of stimulus onset for a word before it's even consciously perceived properly. You can get really early sensorimotor activation. But that doesn't mean sensorimotor information is actually being used to perform that particular cognitive task. That's a different question. And I think you get any activation that comes out of word processing or sentence processing, it's a whole brain thing, and it's massively messy. So attempting to get your conditions that allow you to pull apart routes of processing, whether it's a sensorimotor route or a linguistic route. I've not seen anybody model that properly yet. So the longer answer then is no, not really. Not in a way that I would trust the data.
Great. I think that's our basic problem when we work with brain measures. Yeah.
Very messy, and nobody's using big enough sample sizes.
Totally. And some people just try and fragment them so much that it's kind of pointless. So
it is. It's possible to torture the data a little bit too much. So
yes.
it gives you the answer that you want. Yeah.
But so, Professor, we have no more questions here, except like great speech. We loved it. As I said, we have been reading a bit about that for a while, and it's amazing, really amazing to see your research, to see your data. I don't know if Alicia wants to say something too before we close.
Thank you.
I just want to thank you. I'm like a huge fan. I love reading your papers, so it's an honor to have you here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. There were some great questions there. So yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for your availability, for the great speech. And that's it. I'll switch to Portuguese just to say farewell to the people still watching us. Muito obrigada quem ficou aqui até agora. Lembrando que a gente ainda tem um mini curso à tarde e tem uma última mesa para apresentação de trabalho à noite, se eu não me engano é às 6 horas. Então, fiquem por aí ainda. Vemos vocês à tarde e muito obrigada a todos. Bye, bye.
Obrigada, gente.